Hello and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. This will be an introductory lecture on identity, literary aesthetics, and psychoanalysis, or tracking social desire. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green. I'm the founder and initiator for the Center of Critical and Cultural Theory. This is one of a number of different videos introducing us to various strands in theoretical discourse. While I'm going to be focusing on Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan today, I in no way present their theory as currently relevant in therapeutic circles or in medical contexts. What I am doing is focusing on what their thinking does to help us analyze aesthetic texts and literature. So the observations that they make may have been criticized in other circles, especially gender critique, which I will probably have other lecture videos on. But this just gives us a basics to understanding their language and how it might apply and help us think about literature and literary analysis. And I mean literature in a very broad sense, as we'll see in the video itself. So by literature, I mean textuality. So we might read a film as a text. We might read newspapers as literature. I tend to read the discourse of theory as literature itself, which is to say that while some people might be period experts in literary theory, the Victorian novel or something like that, I tend to read the discourse of theory as a literary production. So I want to blur maybe traditional lines between literature as the object studied and theory as the discourse that studies it, but rather see theory as a discourse that is productive of literary contexts as well, and a kind of form of creative writing. I will make an argument for literature and literary study as being a way to track what I call social desire here. I'll get to that as I maneuver on through the video. But let's just go ahead and jump in right away now. So I'm going to focus a little bit on Sigmund Freud and also his successor, Jacques Lacan. And Jacques Lacan, when he was a younger psychologist, psychoanalyst later, he was studying children in the 1930s, and he writes this text that you can find in various different anthologies and online, often called just the mirror stage. And when he's talking about the mirror stage, he's updating Freud's Oedipal complex. And so I'm going to have to delve a little bit into Freud and the Oedipal complex to see how that's kind of showing up behind Jacques Lacan. I want you to think about it a little bit like this. If you know the Star Wars movies, and Luke Skywalker or any Jedi Knight is going to eventually, in their process of becoming a Jedi, they're going to construct their own lightsaber. In a way, I think of Jacques Lacan as constructing his own lightsaber to talk about the same sorts of things that Sigmund Freud was talking about with the Oedipal complex. And as he updates his notion and comes across the mirror stage, he deals with some of the critical problems that other people might charge Sigmund Freud for. So his binary genderism, for example, there's much more fluidity in the Lacanian model than there is in the Freudian model. And this is how critical discourse moves successively through generations of people as people get updated. And so this is not to say that people have not updated Lacan since he wrote, but this video will give you a sense of moving from one person's thinking to another, and then how that might influence the ways we might make inquiries of literary texts. Now, why do this to begin with? Well, I think one of the reasons is that on the street, or when people hear about literature, capital L literature, they often think of it as big name authors, such as Shakespeare, for example, and they associate it with, in the same ways that we might associate a sort of notion of high art, Picasso, Mark Rothko, Frida Kahlo, major figures, right? And yes, those are definitely people worth studying and reading and thinking about. But I want to have a broader sense of literature that does not have that class bias built into it, that this is the elitist genre of texts that we read so that we feel like we're smarter or better than anyone else. That's not why we do literary theory or critical theory or anything like that. If anything, my approach to critical and cultural theory is going to be as a way to understand a wider swath of what we might think of as cultural production to begin with, and various different theoretical trajectories help us understand a wider aspect of life, rather than just the kinds of cultural products that are put up onto a kind of pedestal by certain groups of people for certain groups of audiences. So, okay, let's jump in. In the 1930s, Jacques Lacan starts theorizing this thing called the mirror stage. He gives up on it, and his language changes quite a bit later on in his thinking, but we'll focus on this today. And he's comes up with it thinking about babies. And so if you think about babies, just generally, when a baby first comes out of its mother, and so we're going to assume that this is a healthy birth, that there's not a C-section or something like this. Here's what we should think about, like the first 9 months or so of a human life. So you start out as a bunch of cells, and they're growing together in the womb, and the entire time you're surrounded by fluid. It's warm fluids, the same temperature as your insides and outsides. You end up floating as a young being in water, so you're in kind of a sensory deprivation tank, if you can think about it, the womb that way. And you have a direct feeding line to your stomach, and the baby's kind of pushing against the walls and starting to learn to kick and move its body, especially as it gets bigger. And then eventually one day you've turned, hopefully, kind of with your head towards the bottom, you're floating kind of upside down. The water drains around you, and you start getting pushed through this small opening. The vagina then squeezes you into an embodied self-formation, and there's all sorts of theories about what it means to go through that pressurized birth and the squeezing, and how that affects our psyche later on. I'm not going to get into that today, but it's just interesting to think about. So you're squeezed through this opening, and you come out into the world as a baby, and you're feeling air on your skin for the first time. It's kind of cold, and you're kind of sticky, and there's like weird people and maybe bright lights and noises and stuff, and it's all together a rather possibly traumatic experience. And so none of us tend to remember our births from right off. And then your feeding tube is clipped, you're turned upside down, you're spanked on the butt, and you've got a big needle that's usually put into your foot, and it's like, welcome to the world, right? So there's a lot going on, and probably a reason why we don't really remember the birth moment consciously. The baby, at once the baby settles down, they're kind of like this, Big eyes, big eyes. They look surprised all the time, right? And they're awake for a while, and maybe they're fussy, maybe they eat, and then they go back to sleep. And then they awake for a little while, and their eyes are really big, and they're taking in so much information. Your brain is taking in information in the formative days and months of your life. And this happens with any time you're learning anything new. So if you're new to theory and you're trying to read theoretical discourse, a lot of times you'll probably fall asleep within a couple of paragraphs because your brain is trying to take in this new way of approaching language. That once you get some of it down, it kind of you start getting used to reading it, and it doesn't seem heady, and it doesn't seem like people are just using big words to sound smart. You realize that people are really generally trying to explain something in the best way that they can, but it might be something very complicated that they're trying to explain. And so Lacan, in studying young children, noticed that, and maybe you've noticed this yourself, like if you give a mirror to an infant, they're kind of wobbly and they can't hold their head up. And you don't really notice that much, but wait a few months and you hold a baby up to a mirror and the baby gets really excited and starts smiling and maybe reaching out at it. And so Lacan was theorizing that something particularly is happening in terms of really important stages of human development here. Now, the mirror stage is a metaphor, just like the Oedipal complex is a metaphor. So he's not saying that every baby needs to be able to see itself in the mirror to go through the mirror stage. He's just seeing that this is an externalized way of talking about what might be happening internally. And so I'll come back to that in a little bit here, but let's just jump back to Sigmund Freud here, to Lacan's teacher, and to the Oedipal complex, and then I'll build back into the mirror stage here. So, as many people will know watching this, we have a general discourse in our culture that we've inherited from Sigmund Freud, whether you like him or whether you hate him. This discourse where we associate this kind of trio of entities, the id, ego, and superego. And the id is the unconscious, the unformed part of our psyche. The ego is the I, and the word ego just means first person I in Greek. That's where we get it. Whenever I use that first person pronoun, capital I, in English, I'm talking, it's a reference to an entity, right? But I was probably using that first person I, well, I know I was using it when I was a little kid. And the I that I am today, when I'm making this YouTube video, is not the same I that what I was when I was 9 years old, for example. And the cells in my body, I'm probably not even the same physical makeup of material in the world. And so that I is a reference to a particular moment in time as well. It's a almost like if I'm my mind is a psyche of like ink in a pen. The I writes down the is the tip of the pen that the ink comes out of, and it's in that particular instance that something is formulated into something. And so there's that tension between the individuation of myself and the unconscious. Now, the superego is going to be something that comes in and develops along the same lines as what Lacan will call the mirror stage. The superego is sometimes called the law of the father. And in Freudian thought, this refers to the Oedipal drama. So now Freud thought of himself as a as a material neurologist, as someone who's studying the brain, and he thought that the brain science would eventually find the mechanism in the brain by which he was articulating the Oedipal complex. So Freud turns to mythology in order to find a way to explain what he thinks is going on in the brain, and to a wide audience of people. And then he's also drawing on other scientists of the time, so particularly the work of someone like E.B. Tylor, who has a book about primitive culture. And so he's drawing on late 19th century anthropology as well, and an emphasis on historicism that develops in Europe in the 19th century especially. An impulse towards looking at the development of the human species over time. So we could throw Darwin into that particular context, and an emphasis on the biological needs of a species to perpetuate itself. So the emphasis that a species might have to perpetuate its existence through procreation, right? So he thinks of himself very much as a hard scientist in or at least a scientist in the biological sense. But he turns to literature, he turns to myth to communicate to other people. So in the schema of the Oedipal drama, you have the baby who has come out of the mother and is entirely in a state of dependence upon the mother, as we are as mammals. And so if you think about the baby's relationship to its mom, if everything's healthy, mom is able to breastfeed the baby, and the baby needs someone else to feed it, to nourish it, to give it warmth, to give it love. And so there's a close bond, besides the fact that the baby is literally of the mom's body, came out. There's a close bond developed between the mother and the baby. But eventually, as the baby gets older, the baby has to learn to realize that it cannot always have mom's attention 100% of the time. So other factors are going to come in to divert mom's attention. And, if it's an only child, for example, in a very heteronormative family binary, or nuclear family type of binary that was indicative of the social context for Freud in Vienna in the late 19th century, the first person who might take attention away from the mother is going to be the father. And so Freud characterizes the father as an entity that kind of blocks the baby's ability to have the mom's breast in its mouth. And that's just a figure of speech, right? That's to say, like, that this potential figure takes mom's attention away from the baby, and therefore takes away the baby's concern for its own life. And so sets up a sort of competition. The baby also realizes that they are powerless against the father to negotiate. And so what happens is the baby's desire for the mother's breast, which is not necessarily sexual, as the way it might get portrayed by Jim Morrison or The Doors or something. It is sexual in the sense that it relates to the propagation of the species, right? Being prevented from having a mother's breast or the milk from the mother means that the baby has to look elsewhere to have its needs met. And so what this starts is a cycle of first repression, like, I want this thing, I can't have it, so my needs are repressed. And then from that, I look to something else to fulfill my needs. If I'm talking from the baby's perspective. And so something comes to substitute for that initial need. And it might be a blue blanket, it might be Teletubbies, it might be a pacifier, it could be all sorts of things. And it could be many things, right? So, but what we get is the displacement over and over again of an initial desire, and it's displaced because of this imposition of something else that creates for Freud, what he calls liminality, right? So it's a line, that's what liminality means. And the subliminal is going to be the unconscious, right? Sub means under. And the conscious part is going to be the manifest content. So you have latent or unconscious content, and you have this liminality, this liminal thing that is imposed by this relationship to the father that says that I cannot get the thing that I want whenever I want it, and breaking through the unconscious into the things that might symbolize that initial desire is called manifest content or consciousness, and that gets associated especially with the ego and how the ego, the individual I, determines meaning in its life, particularly a meaning that orchestrates a kind of whole plethora of representations that stand in for the initial thing that the baby cannot have. I'm going to skip to the next slide here. Freud in Totem and Taboo takes this idea of the Oedipal complex that he has been describing, again, just as a metaphor for what happens as the brain develops. And it might sound kind of harsh, but the competition that Freud characterizes with the father and the baby is something that people actually need, because it's from that sort of need to repress ourselves and not get the thing that we want that structures the way that we perceive social mores or norms in the world. And so externalized senses of how to act in the world are coming from that matrix of the liminality that comes from some sort of impulse from the superego that says you can't have the thing that you want at all the time, right immediately, whenever you want it. By 1913, which is a little bit later in Freud's career, he is looking at other anthropologists, and he's doing the same sort of attempt to articulate what's going on in an individual's mind at the social or cultural level. And he does it by thinking about notions of totem and taboo. Now, he's taken the term taboo, which comes from Oceania, so Polynesian cultures, cultures around Australia, all the way out into Hawaii, that have different similar concepts of this term taboo, particularly in Maori culture. And they have been, the Europeans like Freud have been introduced to this concept from the writings of James Cook in the late 1700s as he goes down to Australia and begins the colonizing process over there. So like many concepts that get taken from indigenous cultures and brought into European culture, it goes through a kind of translation process and a distortion from what it might mean in the original society. So if we look at my first bullet point here, Freud imposes what I call a Euro-Christian fantasy structure, connecting the taboo notions of sacre. Or I should say maybe connecting taboo to notions of soccer. What do I mean there? So I approached this a little bit in my book, which is called Transatlantic Political Theology of Psychedelic Aesthetics, Enchanted Citizens. And a number of chapters, I think especially a chapter called the Problem of the Perennial and a European Fantasy Structure. I've updated my language these days to a Euro-Christian fantasy structure. Notice that I use the term Euro-Christian all lowercase and one word. When I use that, I'm not talking about a religion, but I'm talking about a social movement that comes out of Europe between the time that Rome embraces Christianity and it becomes the religion of empire, all the way through the present day. And so it is that particular social formation that I think is distinct from Judaism, and that may have different breaks within it, such as the Protestant Reformation, for example, but that still characterizes a certain modality for thinking about how the world works and how reality works, that then informs people like Freud, who of course is not a Christian, right? He's a secular Jew, but he's still in the milieu of what I call Euro-Christian culture. And that culture, first of all, imposes a kind of linear temporality onto reality. It wants to see human development at the species level and kind of universality, and developing over time towards a kind of progress, and that progress goes towards rationality, or what the Europeans called the Enlightenment, especially. And Enlightenment is what produces the sciences. Even in their secularized form, they're reacting to this Euro-Christian fantasy structure. In that structure, women and children and indigenous people are closer to nature. Indigenous people give the colonizing Europeans a view into a time that their modernity has moved beyond. So when Europeans look at indigenous cultures around the world in this fantasy structure that they have, they see not only that the indigenous people are somehow closer to nature, but that also by studying them, that they can have access to a more primordial sense of what humanity is. So it's kind of like looking back in time. And so this worldview tends to situate indigenous people as either outside of time or as having some sort of access to archaic human life or archaic Homo sapiens. That's all part of a structure that is imposed onto indigenous people by the European mindset. So when Freud takes the notion of taboo from people like Marcel Mauss, or Emile Durkheim, Marcel Mauss was Durkheim's nephew, and these thinkers of religion and sociology, when he imports the concepts that they've been talking about, such as taboo, he also filters that through a notion of the sacred or sacre. And this is another Euro-Christian concept. The concept of the sacred just means to set aside, to make something special in and of itself. And so even that notion of the sacred, although it often gets used in relationship to indigenous peoples of the world, is a particular context that comes from Euro-Christians that they want to assign to other people. So if I take it, how does this work, for Freud and soccer? We could look at, there's a whole project by Giorgio Agamben called Homo Soccer, which is about laws that existed in ancient Rome. And this is exactly the context that I'm saying informs Freud, even though he's Jewish and working quite a bit later than Roman law. But his project on Homo Soccer says that if somebody was designated as Homo Soccer, then anybody in the community could murder that person and they would be immune from prosecution, right? So that's what it meant to set a person aside as sacred. So it wasn't necessarily sacred to be esteemed, right? It could be that you're designated as sacred or set aside so that other people can kill you because you stand outside of the law itself. And so it's not necessarily always a good thing. And that's why I think he wants to associate the taboo with it. So this is a quote from Totem and Taboo. Freud says, "The taboo prohibitions lack all justification and are of an unknown origin. But they may be related to something pre-religious. It's transferable from persons to inanimate objects, and it is the site of pollution," he says. He disagrees with the anthropologist Wilhelm Wundt, and instead wants to connect taboo to neurotic and compulsive impulses. So how does he get to this, and how does it relate to the Oedipal complex? Well, okay, so Freud is influenced by anthropologists and by thinkers like James Frazer, who has written this project. He's still writing it, the full thing, but he's published bits of it at the point that Totem and Taboo comes out. So James Frazer comes up with the he doesn't come up with it, but he is one of many thinkers who impose a reading of myth that is informed by historicism. And it's a particular reading that we call in mythological studies euhemerism. What that means is that the theory of the myth is that somewhere way back in human history that we've forgotten, there was an actual event that happened, and that event developed stories and lore around it. So there was this real event that happened that then became mythologized and became folklore over time. And so we maybe lost the actual instances of the original context, but we get stories around it. So that kind of reading of myth is what draws Sigmund Freud to something like the Oedipus story from the ancient Greeks. And so he's very much trying to think about human development as a species over time. And he finds in the notion of the taboo and the totem a way to talk at the social level about the same impulse that comes from that law of the father. So why is it called the law of the father, really quickly here? So in Freud's thinking, maybe some of you have seen the opening scenes of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which kind of is like a reference to this. But in Freud's thinking, somewhere way, way, way back in our primate history as humans, or maybe before we were fully Homo sapiens, primates, apes that we are, were living in tribes, we're living in small groups. And just like in some ape contexts today, there is a dominant ape. Think of it like maybe a silver-backed mountain gorilla, if you think about Diane Fossey or something like that. And what happens is the strongest male gains the sexual priority over the females of the group. And the lesser males are not allowed to have sex then, or at least they're not allowed to have first pick in terms of who their sexual partners might be. So in Freud's thinking, the lesser apes feel frustrated over time by the fact that this dominant ape has sexual priority, and that they want to perpetuate the species too, so they're driven by their own impulses to procreate. But what happens is they get together at some point and they say, okay, we're going to get together and we're going to overthrow this tyrant of an ape that's preventing our ability to have sex with with female apes. And they do. And so this is a moment of collaboration and cooperation, right? And through that collaboration and cooperation, it works. They overthrow, they kill the primal father, and then maybe they go and they're able to have sex with the opposite sex of the species, but then that's pretty quick and done with. And then they're like, now what? And there is no longer this arcing force that gives kind of order to the tribal structure, to the group structure. And so they come to miss the father, and they come to have a sense of guilt for killing the father. So what do? They set up a symbolic father, and that's where the totem comes from in Freudian thinking, right? So the totem comes in to stand in for a sense of order that did belong to the previous primal father, who has been murdered. This, of course, this impulse is all over Greek mythology, right? From like Zeus overthrowing Kronos, this happens over and over again. And so, when Freud is looking at ancient mythology, especially to the Greeks, that he's aligning that with earlier forms of humanity to begin with. All right. So again, that's that Euro-Christian fantasy structure that's putting this linear temporality onto the world. And so it is from that sort of context that the totem is set up, and that what the beginnings of what might be called ceremony and ritual derive. Because what happens is when you pay your respects to the totem, then that expiates your sins, or it makes you like, it alleviates the guilt that the apes who overthrew their father might have, and then allows them to keep going on in their society. And so that's where Freud will say that something like religion will later develop. That's his impulse. But like anything, that object that becomes the totem is the thing that's venerated, and at the same time is a reminder of the guilt, is a reminder of this very, very fundamental violence that happens within the species. And so it becomes a site of pollution too. And in order to cleanse that pollution, this is where Freud wants to attach it to the neurotic impulse or compulsive impulse, is the impulse to alleviate one's guilt for a primordial type of violence that he sees. So here are a couple of important quotes from the text here. So taboos present as obsessive prohibitions. Present as obsessive prohibitions are very susceptible to displacement. Touching something taboo makes one taboo. Violations can be expiated in various acts, such as washing hands and ceremonies. Initial prohibitions appear in primitive childhood, but then they are maintained through repression. Okay, so in primitive childhood, so again, the Euro-Christian fantasy structure wants to see children and indigenous peoples, because indigenous peoples are in this schema thought of as representing earlier forms of the human species. They also think that children are evolving throughout childhood too. And there is a going theory called a recapitulation theory in science at the time. It's now bunk, so it's not considered relevant anymore, that says that phylogeny and ontogeny, that phylogeny reproduces ontogeny. So what that means is that that the embryo in the uterus, as it is growing, goes through all of the stages of human evolution. So it carries that kind of evolutionary memory, and that's why when we're occasionally we have humans that are born with tails, or I have a brother who was born with an extra finger that didn't work. It was just there and they just clipped it off. These are traits that are called atavistic, right? That means atavistic. They're something that's carried over in our genetic memory from an earlier form that we were as a species, or maybe a different species that we were, and it might have an appendage like a tail that we don't need anymore. And so the science at the time was thinking that all of our embryos go through this kind of genetic coding process that includes all of our evolution as a species up to that point. And then, of course, you can see how eugenics sort of plays into that, because the Euro-Christians saw themselves as more rational and above all other humans on Earth, and then they translated that into notions of skin color and racism and things like that. And so they wanted to have the purest kind of breeding, so that they could keep perpetuating what they thought of as the most dominant part of the species. So this is all scientifically bunk, but it was very, very present at the time that Freud was writing. So to come back to Freud here, he says, Totemism's law, which derives from the oldest and most important taboo, according to him, Totemism's law involves the two most important prohibitions. The first is killing the totem animal, and the second is avoiding sex within the totem group. So you don't kill the totem animals. You've set up an animal that is then stands in as the place for the primal father, and then that animal becomes a relationship. So this is, again, I'm not meaning to characterize indigenous current society this way. There's more going on there, but I'm just summarizing Freud's thinking here. So in Freud's schema here, that the totem animal, or maybe the clan animal, then because it stands in for the father, is going to give that kind of social order to things. It externalizes things, and the person who belongs to that totem animal obviously doesn't kill the animal itself, because that would be like reproducing the initial violence. And then from that, and you can think of earlier groups of people living together, maybe coming up with this is like, well, if the group is too small and everybody's just having sex with each other, then pretty soon everybody just is related to everybody else. And this is bad for the species, right? Because there isn't enough genetic variance going on. So what happens is that humans start to differentiate each other from different groups, so that people of the one group might marry or have sex with people outside of the other group. And that encourages more natural selection over time. Again, this is how Freud is being influenced by someone like Darwin. He says the basis of taboo is a forbidden action for which there exists a strong inclination in the unconscious. So even though there might be this forbidden impulse towards, say, incest, for example, right? That you wouldn't have sex with a person who was considered your sibling, and this doesn't have to be in terms of like biology in like the current way that we think about it, but within your own family structure, you wouldn't have sex with your own sibling. But that there is, he says at least, that there's also an inclination, because there's people want to have sex and they want to procreate, but there are some people that you are not supposed to procreate with, and that comes from the primal father, that comes from the superego. And so you're supposed to displace your desire for not only your mother, but your desire for any kind of type of sexuality with other family members, and find that the fulfillment of that desire in a being who's outside of your family, right? So there's always a kind of tension. It's kind of a knot of the thing that is very prized and also the thing that can become polluted. Okay, so I want to come back to Lacan now. I've given Freud a little synopsis of Freud and the Oedipal complex, and then Totem and Taboo, and how that is tied particularly to Freud's reading of sexuality and evolution in his period. Now I come back to Lacan. Remember, I said that the mirror stage in Lacan is his updating of Freud's Oedipal complex. So you have some similarities. There's a triune thing, like three-part thing. And again, just like my indigenous people, friends from Turtle Island, where I live, North America, Native American friends of mine, they always say this, like that for Native American people, it's always concepts of four and balance, or the four directions or something, and that they will contrast the Euro-Christian worldview as being odd to them, because the Euro-Christians always want to focus on threes. So there might be some sort of like previous Trinitarian sort of concept at work here as well, and I'm just not going to parse that out, but you might be able to guess and make some ideas when we think about the imitation of Christ, or the imago, or the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Where's the Holy Spirit, right? Those types of things. But I'm not going to go into much of a religious studies lecture in this particular discourse, but it is important to see when we're studying theory that when we have a lot of theories out or theoretical discourse out, so this one's on psychoanalysis, and you start comparing what other people do in different disciplines, you start seeing that all of the discourses are trying to get at the same kind of thing. And that's what theory does, it might have different sort of avenues or trajectories, but it's trying to describe like similar impulses. And the different ways of describing it, once you get more under your belt, then you're able to like kind of treat it like, I don't know, like a prism, like our lenses in a microscope. So that's like, I don't know, this isn't working. Like my Euro-Christian lens isn't working, but you know, what might like indigenous perspectives give to this context and to the problem? What might that worldview bring that my own worldview doesn't give me access to, for example, excuse me. So Lacan thinks the mirror is really important, and he says that what it happens when the baby that's old enough can see itself in the mirror and is smiling and laughing is that something like this is going on in its head. So this is weird, but imagine that I'm Roger, I'm holding my son who's mini Roger. My son knows who I am, he knows who dad is. But I'm holding him up to a mirror, and so in the kid's head, the baby's kind of like something like this is going on at like split second, like super fast, right? Like light bulbs going off in the baby's head. The baby, as they're laughing and getting excited, what they do is the baby recognizes that Roger is in the mirror, or dad's in the mirror, right? But dad's holding me at the same time. So how can that be? Except that the thing that looks like Uncle Fester, that's like bald and like looking in the mirror, like that thing is me, the baby. And so the baby starts to get a recognition of its own self. And really quickly, two things follow from this that are important for Lacan, which is the development of language and the development of being able to crawl, sit up, walk, move around. And so embodiment is really important. You have to have a kind of sense of yourself as at least two things, or a sense of comparison to yourself to maneuver through the world, or to think like, you know, when you're thinking about embodiment, to think like, oh man, like does my butt look really big in those pants, or do I look fat when I'm looking in the mirror? So body image becomes a really important thing as well. Fundamentally, in the mirror, what Lacan sees going on is a distinction between I, or ego, and ego is just, again, the Greek word for the first person I that we use, and the image of myself that I have, or the imago, me. And so there's a gap that's created, and psychologists call this gap desire. Why is it called desire? Because desire is structured on the context of lack. It's the thing that we don't have. If I want a hamburger for dinner, for example, I want it because it's not in my stomach yet. And so what are the steps I'm going to take in order to make myself achieve my desire? Well, you know, I'm either going to like go into my refrigerator and I'm going to open it and see if I have hamburger meat, or if I don't have it, then I'm going to like find a restaurant and go until I get it in there. And so all of my movement in life is structured according to the thing that I desire, but the thing that I also lack, right? So if we keep going here, to have identity, it has to be at least two things. There might be more. There are multiple identity personality disorders, things like that, although there might be debates about that. Trudy Chase, if you follow the old famous cases in psychology. But for this lecture, identity means at least two. You have to have two things to compare, like Batman and Bruce Wayne, right? Or identical twins, you have to have two twins to compare each other in order to see that they're identical. And so identity is something that in this context does not happen at birth. Identity is constructed later on through the mirror stage. And this is really important, I think, for thinking about identity today, because we operate in a world of identity politics. We argue about whether or not something aspects of our identity are a choice or not a choice, especially when we start thinking about things like gender or non-binariness or queerness, things like that. To what extent is a person born that way, and to what extent is it is gender fluidity something that is ideological or something related to identity, which would come afterwards, right? Or we have this language of like that we use in professional discourse all the time today, like, as a white man, I am never going to know what it feels like to be pregnant. So for me, I don't think that I have the right to make a choice for a woman about her body. But that and how she's going to whether or not she's going to have an abortion or something like that. This is going on as I make this lecture. There are so many different aspects and ways to think about identity, right? That we can call it nationalism. We can call aspects of it sex or sexual orientation, gender expressivity, all different than sexual orientation, right? That my gender is different than my sexuality, and my sexuality is different than my sexual orientation, different from my religion, different from my nation, different from how old I am. All the categories that in university culture we call inclusive excellence today. So how do we account for all of these aspects of identity is a really big part of current discourse today. Again, one of the reasons why we might, in the Center of Critical and Cultural Theory, be interested even in any kind of language that can give us a little bit more nuanced access to what identity is to begin with, right? So back to Lacan, there's a split happens with the mirror stage. We need the split in order to develop language and to develop a sense of embodiment. It creates a subject-object split that is all in our heads. It is separated by a gap that psychologists call desire. And then there's the subject or the subjective I, which is sometimes used in philosophy, and the object or me. And our language does this. The English language works in terms of subject, verb, object. I am Roger. I is the subject, am is the verb, Roger is the object, right? And we have had that rigid syntactic structure since the French invasion of England, which maneuvers, moves the language from the Anglo-Saxon context, or the West Saxon contexts, especially, is what I studied when I was getting my English PhD, and the modern English context, right? So you get this kind of rhythmic flow that comes into the language where, if I were to quote Chaucer, for example, "Wan that opera with the sure sota, the droop of march, the person to the rota and bar, that every vein is sweet the core, of which virtue engendered is the floor." That is iambic rhythms that we get from the rigid syntax that our language develops as it becomes heavily syntactical, subject, verb, object, and less inflected, right? So Latin languages, Anglo-Saxon, they were more inflected. Spanish is that way, like yo la tango, like the band, I have it, right? But the O at the end of tango and yo, I, both do the work for situating it as first person. English slowly gives that up as it becomes modern English, which is the Shakespearean English that we have. So Shakespeare's not Old English, even if he might seem hard to understand. And Shakespeare sounds something like this, like in Hamlet, for soliloquy. "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt thought and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannons against self-slaughter." O God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world, that it should come to this. Those lines from Hamlet, like, we understand those, but we don't. We can hear the rhythm in Chaucer, but we don't necessarily understand. Our ear doesn't quite understand Chaucer Middle English. You can read it on the page a lot easier. But to come back to this language structure, I, subject, verb, object, that's so much embedded in our language as English speakers, is also reflective of this identity, and that will shape the way that we experience the world, not just through talking, but through the neural pathways that our brain forges as we learn that language at an early age. The worldview of that language is then encoded into us as a being. So again, when I use the terminology like Euro-Christian, for example, it's not just about like Christianity as a religion, but that there is a worldview that comes from Europe that is embedded and deeply, closely associated with our linguistic impulses as well, such that many different cultures from Europe that spoke different but closely related languages, like French and English, or French and Spanish, French and Italian, they could all go out and dominate the rest of the world with papal bulls, with the ideas of doctrine of discovery, for example, which I have other lectures on. And they are expressing the same worldview of Euro-Christianity, even if they speak different languages, and even if there are nuances between Catholicism and Protestantism, or various different schisms within Protestantism themselves. So we're looking at something deeper when we're looking at worldview itself, and it's very, very closely related to linguistic structure. So in all of our heads, Lacan says something like this is going on. There's a subject, me. There's an object, me. This split is what allows me to, like, later on ask myself, Roger, did you do a good job explaining that really heady Lacanian thought on the mirror stage to the critical theory audiences today? Right, later on, it's my ability to have that internal conversation with myself, my internal self-criticism that is dramatized by the idea of the mirror stage. Like, I needed to go through the mirror stage to be able to be self-reflective in that particular way. So with the development of the ego, then the I becomes separate from itself. And this, of course, as I've said, makes linguistic representation possible, because words just stand in for things, right? A cat in English is chat in French, C-H-A-T, right? A dog in English is chien in French. So the different words are sound signs that stand in for a different concept. So Lacan, this is where we start seeing him looking a little bit closer to that Freudian model as well. So the mirror comes in, creates a separation between self and other, self as other, and yet at the same time that there's something that's both beneath the I and the Roger in the statement, I am Roger. There's something that is broader that holds that together. And that's going to be what Lacan's version of the unconscious is, and where he will locate what he calls the real. The reality for Lacan is the unseen thing that motivates me through desire. It's that hunger that drives me towards a restaurant where I can get the hamburger, or the store where I can buy the hamburger meat to cook for myself. It is not conscious. It's not something that I just decide to do, but something that drives me from beneath, and that drives, like, of course my consciousness helps me decide, like, well, I'm going to get a hamburger instead of having spaghetti tonight, right? So I might have some choice in the matter, but I have to eat, right? And it's the thing that pushes that, and my consciousness helps me find out the best way possible to get that fulfilled. So the real is the thing that we don't have access to in Lacan, and it's separated by the symbolic and the imaginary, which kind of operate like the subject-object split in Lacan. Later, Lacan gets really, really convoluted around ideas of the symbolic and the imaginary, so it's not my attempt today to explain all of Lacanian thought in one lecture. I'm going for what psychoanalysis as a kind of way of thinking does in order to get to literary criticism today, right? So, but I will say that the overlapping of these three concepts, the murky space in the center there, is what Lacan will call in different lectures in his writings, or l'écriture, the writings in French, objet à, right, which is the other and the place of the subject. So with that is again relating to that impulse within my mind to distinguish myself from myself from self, right? Self as other. The real, if I take it out of that, the real is the thing that deconstellates ruptures, or what Maurice Blanchot, the literary critic, calls disaster. And what do we mean by that? Well, let's think about children's literature, for example. Think about the story of Bambi, which comes from near where Freud was working, and it's actually kind of an allegory for trench warfare in World War I if you go back and read it as an adult. And so Freud at the time was dominating European thought, but children's literature as a genre of literature, just one reason to study Freud, is just because so much of children's literature as a genre is influenced by his thinking. So think about Bambi. If you've seen the Disney film, that's fine. What happens is, like Bambi is born as a little baby, and we follow Bambi growing up into adulthood, right? We follow the learning and the development. In German novels, this was called Bildungsroman, or building novel. And so we get the experiences of Bambi growing up, and he's got his friends like Thumper, and his mom is around, and then every now and then, that like buck shows up on the edge of the ravine or something. It's like kind of shadowy and big horns, and it's like that's the father, right? The father, hush, because the father's got this kind of grandness to it, but he's like afraid. Bambi's afraid of the father, right? And eventually, Bambi's like with his mom and connected to her. And what happens eventually is that, of course, Bambi's mom gets shot, and it's sad. And that devastation of that is the disruption of Bambi's life, because he can no longer ever get back to his mom because she is gone forever, right? So children's literature does this all the time. Babar the elephant, total colonizer that he is. If you go back and read that book, it's like an allegory for colonization. But Babar the elephant, in the picture book, his mother dies from hunters early on, and Harry Potter's parents die on page 1 of the novel, right? They're murdered. And what that does is it sets up, in an Oedipal sense, it sets up that sense of like the situation of symbolic displacement. I cannot have access to my parents, and yet I have to, as Harry Potter, go on throughout my life and find out my way through 8 or so novels. So the real is what comes in and tells us that we cannot have the thing that we want. It's the thing that comes in and says that thing that you substituted for the original desire that you wanted is just that. It's just a representation. Now what are you going to do? It falls apart, right? Like when our lives fall apart because we thought that we were doing everything right. And then we have come to see that like we invested all of this time and energy into a fantasy structure. So we can think about the symbolic and the imaginary in a couple of different ways, and they can kind of cross each other. So one thing that Lacan will say, first of all, is that if I could just draw like a big circle around all of these things, that is that all of this is social in nature. So I don't want to just call it the social imaginary, or the symbolic, or the personal symbolic. They can cross back and forth with each other, but just for the sake of simplicity today, I'm just going to take one side of it and say, like, the symbolic, for a sense of, like, okay, so I want my mom, but I don't have access to my mom. I like her warmth, but what do I get instead? As a substitute for her warmth, I've got a blanket. I'm going to call it the blue blanket because I recently watched The Producers, which is a funny Gene Wilder movie that deals with the idea of an adult still having a blue blanket. And that blue blanket is one of many blankets. Many blankets could keep me warm, but because I've created a kind of specialness in displacing my mom's affection to the blue blanket, then I am going to hold on to that one in particular. Other people might not care. It's like just the blue blanket or the red blanket or whatever, right? And kids do this all the time. It's like the pacifier or whatever they latch onto to give themselves a sense of safety as they're moving away, stepping away from their mother, right? So the blue blanket then becomes personally symbolic to me. So there is nothing in Lacan that says that the personal or the private is really separate or less social or socially derived than the imaginary. And there are ways that you could think about the blue blanket as the imaginary too, but just to be very, like, intro lecture here. The symbolic, it might mean something particular to one person, but then there's the level of the imaginary. And this, you could maybe call it the social imaginary, which, and then again, they can cross over again. But if I call it the social imaginary, what does that mean? Well, like, you know, you have a kid who goes to school and they need shoes to go to school, but they go to the store with their mom. They're like, I want the shoes that light up, that have the blinking lights on them. Or I want the shoes with roller skates in them. Or I want Crocs or something like this. And what the child has learned is that there's a social imaginary space, sometimes called the symbolic too. So you could switch these up, like I said. But the social imaginary will then it bestows a kind of value that is not just the individual displacement of the baby taking the mom's affection and putting it on the blanket. It's the imaginary that sees that in the culture, the group that you live in, that, yeah, everybody's got shoes, but the cool kids have the shoes that light up. And I want to be like that. And so that identification with an object then transports itself into an imaginary realm. Now, there are ways to, like, flip those out and say, like, all that stuff out in culture is really the symbolic. So sometimes when you read Lacan, it can seem that way. And sometimes you can think about the imaginary as being my personal fantasy structures that I've built up around my own forms of displacement. It's okay either way for this particular lecture. If we were digging deeper into later Lacan, we would want to do some more nuance there. So just throwing that out there, like, don't let me mess you up too much with thinking about this stuff. It's just to say that there's the individuation, and then there's the self, and there's the self and the split within myself, and then there's the self in relationship to the world. So if I go to the next slide, what the I does is that the I becomes separate from itself with that individual structure, I and other, and my own head that produces language, that produces embodiment. And then there's a separation between myself and the world itself. And I can see myself as an other or as an object in the world. So I'm going to tell a story here, as I tell my students when I use these slides in the class. And you can pause this and just look at it and think, what is the story I'm trying to tell with this slide? Usually takes my students about 10 to 15 seconds, and then one of them raises their hand and says it's the story of evolution. So look at how smart we are. Look at how easily we can recognize something like that. And think about the assumptions that come from that, right? Because we have ways of reading and ways of looking, as the Jonathan Berger book, Ways of Seeing, is a really good theoretical book to start with. Well, how do you get that kind of reading? Well, you go, in English language, you've learned that text moves from left to right, from the top left hand of the screen, and it moves its way down, just like the linear alphabetic text at the top of this slide. So we read the pictures the same way. You've got the silverback mountain gorilla here, and then you've got our closest relative who's living, at least, the chimpanzee, who's only 2 chromosomes different from us as fellow primates that we are. And anthropologists in the 20th century noticed that chimpanzees will go and strip a branch of leaves and then take the branch and go stick it down an anthill and pull it up and eat the ants off of it, right? So this was a big discovery because, as my students are quick to point out, it shows that they can use tools. Yes, it does show that they can use tools, but there's more to using tools. Why are tools significant? Well, it shows that the ape has a sense of temporality and futurity and a sense of desire and a sense that's saying, like, I could eat lots of things. Chimpanzees have a wide variety of things that they can eat, leaves and such, occasionally for some of them meat. But that chimpanzee on that particular day said, I want to have this particular thing. I can't get it right away, but I can change my environment in order to get the thing that I want. Now humans take that idea and they run with it, and they make hand axes. Earlier archaic Homo sapiens do this, hand axes with the bones, or with sharp rocks so that they can break open bones. And the theory goes that we as a species ate the bone marrow so we could come across a carcass that had been picked over by vultures and killed by a lion, but we can knock on the bones with our hand axes and we can break it open and get the high protein nutrients from bone marrow, and that is what helped our brains grow a little bit bigger than other animals on the planet. And so we take that idea of being able to change our environment that has to do with anticipation and desire as well, that being able to be attentive to the thing unseen, and we develop agriculture, we domesticate animals or subjugate animals, depending on what your perspective is there, and then eventually we get technology, and that comes from this. And so it is this kind of linear evolutionary model, reminiscent of what I've been saying about Euro-Christianity. One thing that my students don't often think about is the fact that language itself is technology. So we as humans come to define ourselves through the ways that we use technology and tools to shape our world. But we often forget that language is a technology. So language is something that groups of humans developed among one another in order to help cooperate with one another and to adapt to the environment, right? And to live better. So language itself is a kind of technology. There's a biological basis for the development of our ability to perceive others' feelings in the most recently evolved parts of the human brain. Lacan was only partially aware of this, but he referred to certain animal studies available to him during his time period that require the mimicking of other members of the species for development. He cites scientists who successfully used mirrors with female pigeons' gonad maturation when another pigeon was not present. And this is in that famous text, The Mirror Stage as a Formative Function of the Eye as Revealed by Psychoanalytic Experience. Most recently, brain science makes these arguments with respect to humans in general. So let me go back to the female gonad, the maturation thing. So basically the thought, what was done, and this is maybe sad in terms of lab experiments, is you take a pigeon who's never seen another pigeon, and you put a mirror into the cage. And maybe people do this with their parakeets all the time, is they put mirrors into the cage too, right? But when you put the mirror into the cage, then the bird goes through puberty, develops their reproductive organs. And so there is something that we as animals sort of need to do, is we need to like see or be around in some ways others like us in order to completely develop in terms of going through puberty. Now, if we take that to the more recent stuff, there's been a lot more studies since what we call the decade of the brain, which is the first decade of the 20th century, the 21st century. And we've seen a lot of work building on the earlier, the so-called reptilian brain, the fight or flight responses, and areas such as like the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are sometimes called the emotion parts of the brain. And what we've developed, in addition to growing the kind of cerebral stuff all around, the outer stuff, what we've developed as a species is the ability to imagine ourselves in another person's position or in another situation. That's something that has an evolutionary function because it allows us to problem solve imaginatively and adapt to difficult situations. It also helps us develop the emotions of compassion, right? And ethics. Some scientists will say that women have this more than men, a little bit more in their brains, not because of the particular gender of our particular society, which is going through all sorts of fluctuations around gender and expressivity and gender identification, but because as animals over a much, much longer period of time, because women give birth and because they have often been the caretakers in the sense that their breasts give milk to babies, that over time women have developed a little bit more emotional intelligence than men. Not to say that men can't develop it, but that if we're talking about evolution, maybe the females of the species are a little bit more evolved in that sense. And of course, we get into all sorts of controversies around that kind of stuff. So I'm throwing it out there a bit playfully. But something to think about, and going back to the importance of that connection that a mother and a child would have, looking down into its eyes while breastfeeding. And we have different apparatuses now so that men can carry and hold babies in similar ways too, right? To make that kind of bonding happen as well. So if we go back to thinking about bodies in the world really quickly, Lacan says the I also becomes an object in the world, potentially harmed or loved by others. Lacan says that the baby understands itself as the object of its mother's affection. Quickly, the baby learns that it has competition, right? Again, that's just Freud coming through Lacan, right? If the baby understands that it's the object of the mother's affection, then what happens when dad or brother or sister, somebody comes in and distracts them? Well, they're in competition for that thing that the baby wants all to itself. So when we look and take this out to the social level as well, I pulled this picture from a great book by Michael Taussig, who's an anthropologist, called What Color is the Sacred? And this is not Taussig in the picture. This is actually Bronislaw Malinowski. And I don't want to take him too far out of context here because Bronislaw Malinowski's anthropological work did a lot to help us get rid of these 19th century pseudoscientific notions that there's a biological thing called race, and that the so-called white man is more superior than people of color around the world. This is all part of the Euro-Christian fantasy structure that has no real basis in biological fact. So Malinowski helped us dismantle racial oppression. But in this particular picture, when we see what's going on, I always ask my students, who has the power in this picture? And this kind of stance that Malinowski has, this kind of forward-leaning, strong stance, and this guy is looking relaxed over here, and another guy over here who's leaning up against the tree, and then some people in the background. You have to imagine that there's actually somebody out in front of these people taking this picture, right? The camera person. And so what Taussig says is that you see here that, anthropologists working in the South Pacific, could not wear this getup, this anthropologist white suit getup all the time. It's just oppressive, the heat is. And so what he's doing is he's posing for pictures back home. And so when Europeans see this kind of image back home, it reinforces the idea that they have got control over these other people that they've sent their anthropologists to go and study and create knowledge about the human species. And so it reinforces a cultural concept of ethnocentrism and even racial superiority over time. But it's all a part of a representational game, as Taussig says, that even the people who are standing around here, who are posing in different positions, they're not they're participating in it, but they're not playing the same semiotic game that the newspapers and the photographer are doing as this gets sent around the rest of the world. And so what's important here is that being objectified is not always necessarily a bad thing. We might like it when our lover thinks that we're hot, right? It might be nice to be the object of someone else's affection. The baby understands itself and is affirmed by the object of being the object of its mother's affection. But unfortunately, also in the world of human sociality, humans objectify other humans, whether it's in gender subordination or in some sort of racial subordination, or we could think of the Holocaust and people being, their bones being ground up and made into pathways and skin being made into lampshades, the ultimate objectification of human beings, right? That is obviously an awful thing that humans are capable of doing to each other. Critical theorist Max Horkheimer calls it a version of instrumental reason, right? Where reason has sort of gone so far beyond even scientific reason that we don't even have control over it anymore. Lacan says that the mirror stage is a drama whose internal thrust is precipitated from insufficiency to anticipation. So what does he mean there? Well, he means that, as babies, we're insufficient. We have needs that must be fulfilled. We have to eat to survive. But later on, when we're toddlers, when we're little kids, a little kid can be like, "Mom, what are we having for dinner?" "We're having chicken," she says. And the kid's like, "But I want macaroni and cheese," right? I know that I could get multiple things that might fulfill my needs, and so I've created instead an anticipation where I've localized my desire onto one thing, and then the mom has to decide whether she's going to make macaroni and cheese and indulge their child, or is she going to say, "Tough luck, you have to eat the chicken." The separation necessary in the mirror stage introduces the ability to represent in terms of language, because all language is representation, as I've said, and also the ability to perceive and eventually narrate time. Why narrate time? Well, because it's anticipation of desire that structures one towards a futurity and that drives us, our things that we don't have are what drive us through time. And when we tell the stories of that, that's where narration comes from. So we could take about a look again at kids. And in children's literature, we see all the time the fundamental building blocks of narrative, which requires anticipation. Again, one of the many reasons why it's important to read little kids' stories over and over again. But if we even look at a joke structure, like in my language, knock knock jokes, there's a script. Knock knock, someone says, someone else says, who's there? Knock knock, who's there? Orange, orange who? Orange you glad to see me, right? So there's a word play on orange and aren't you? And so sonic play. Children often delight in the narrative game even when they don't get the joke or when they can't necessarily make their own jokes. So a kid might come up and be like, Roger, knock knock. And I say, who's there? Blue, blue who? Blue flu, ha 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 ha. And so we see this happening, especially with like 2-year-olds, who are able to see the structure. They know that this person says this, and then I say this, then I say this, or then they say this, and then I say this, and then everybody laughs, right? But they might not be able to come up with their own until they're a little bit older, right? And so the children often delight in the game, even if they don't get the joke or if they can't come up with their own punchlines. Similar time period, we know in my culture, even whether we're Freudian or not, that what is happening with kids when they're about getting to be 2 years old is that they're separating a little bit more from mom, and they're finding out that they just can't have everything that they want all the time in their lives. And they're testing out the power that they might have in the world. And so there's a lot of possessiveness. Mine, that's mine, that's mine. Even my dog would do this. She would have toys that she didn't care about until another dog came over, and then my dog would be like, to collect all of her toys and take them over to her little doggy bed. And so this is something I think that transcends even our own species. But we call the time after the mirror stage the terrible twos. In our culture, and it's because the babies are just frustrated because they're trying to find where they have agency, where they have power in the world. My own father, I have 6 brothers and 2 sisters, and there was a game that he would always play with my siblings when they were toddlers. He would say, like, that's my mommy, and they would say, that's my mommy, that's my mommy, that's my mommy. And they would go back and forth, and it was kind of funny and also a little bit weird. But whatever criticisms that we have of Freud, there's a lot of heteronormative gender roles that he at least described well. I just don't think that they're necessarily the ways that things have to be in society, but he certainly described a particular function of one kind of European derived sense of family structure that pervades culture today, and especially again in literature as well. So we're talking here about need versus lack, right? So we need to be fed, but we don't necessarily need to, get the queen of the palace, right? We might need to procreate, but do we need to procreate with a movie star? That's maybe a way to think about it. For Lacan, we can physically, and we have to physically get what we need. But psychically, we are never able to fulfill our desire. But this is a good thing, according to Lacan, because it's desire that keeps us going in life. So we live a perpetually unfulfilled existence driven by a desire for something, capital O, other, to give us meaning. It's the desire for something that structures our ability to keep going, but also that structures our potential for meaning making. And yet, we see that our structures of desire are not just personal things. This is not just the blue blanket that personally reminds me of my mom's warmth, right? We see that there are structures out in society, out in a social imaginary, for example. Meaning tends to be elusive and related to desire. In some ways, it's subjective, but there are clearly desires that many people share. So think about it. You're going to college. You're going to the Critical Theory Center. You meet the hot security guard. And, things go well, you end up getting married. In my culture, especially, same-sex marriages are welcomed now, which was not always the case in the past. So same-sex couples can now fulfill this social desire of marriage. You have a baby. Oops, you have another baby. You need more money and you need a bigger place to live, right? Now, we recognize that socially in our society as a way that some people structure their life. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to go to get a job. I'm going to meet the person who's right for me. I'm going to get married. I'm going to have a family. I'm going to get a house and settle down, have kids, right? That's one narrative. Now, people can react against that and say, I'm never going to get married, right? But still, the social narrative exists out there. And in fact, that social narrative still is present in your life if you're reacting to it as what psychologists call a reaction formation. So your identity is still formed by the thing that it resists. Just like an atheist is an identity formation that says, I am someone who does not believe in God, but it presumes the idea of a God or people saying that there is a God before the identity formation comes in to begin with. So it's reactionary. Social desires end up structuring a lot of our society, whether or not we all participate in them in the same way or not. And we know that this is historical as well, just from a critical theory perspective. We know that marriages in the West, for example, were not treated as anything more than just like a basic economic alliance, usually among elite people, until after 1215 and the Fourth Lateran Council, which then designated that all marriages had to be approved of by the church. And there's this long process of associating females or women with land and property, and the wedding gifts that are associated with estates that are being transferred. If I think about English law, for example, right now, the estate can belong to a woman, but a woman cannot have control over it. So it becomes something that's passed down as the woman's dowry, for example. And this all goes back to the religious context of the Fourth Lateran Council, for example. So we know the ways we think about marriage and idealize it and structure our lives today, even if we're not Christians or we don't identify as Christians, we are still in a society that is that structures social desire according to those kinds of Euro-Christian norms. Also, many people, who fulfill these social desires, who achieve them, then can get to a kind of breaking point where they don't know what else to do. So in many ways, we have to keep striving, but many people pine for marriage only to feel unfulfilled once they're in the marriage. It's a common problem in my society where most marriages fail. So the ideal that we might have, socially speaking, maybe does not live up to the reality. The reality is that the person that you maybe thought was your number one love of all time deceives you, and you didn't ever know them to begin with. And all of your desires of what marriage is a fantasy structure that the real has broken into and deconstellated, right? No one that I know of who got married in my friend group immediately out of high school, is still married to the same person from early out of high school. I'm not meaning to hex or put a hex on you if you're in that situation. Good for you if you've been able to make it work. But most people can't, because and most marriages in my society fail as well because there's more going on. And so if we're going to be thinking about relationships with other people, we need to be thinking about a wider swath of what we need to sort of balance out and keep ourselves motivated and having our desire keep going in the world. Otherwise, we're going to get depressed, we're going to shut down, and we're not going to be able to get out of bed. That's a problem with motivation and desire, and why we have, clinical studies on, people taking antidepressants and things like that. Coming back to Bambi, coming back to the idea of a metaphysical other, a capital O other, loss eventually is going to play a part in our lives. Bambi loses, in children's literature, it's often tied to the mother, because the mother is symbolic of the thing that you cannot get back to, right? So when we lose somebody close to us, we often turn not to ourselves, our internal dialogue, but ourselves with some externalized type of entity or being. And I'm not meaning to just demean religion or just call it a social function of our brains or something like that. There are ways to theologically, maneuver with that I'm not going to go into in lecture today. But where at least one of the things that religion seems to do for people is it gives us answers to the loss that is the irreplaceable loss. And so death is oftentimes associated with Lacan's the real. The reality is that we are all going to, at some point in our lives, die. That's just going to happen. And how do we deal with the irreplaceable thing? How do we maneuver forward? Well, at least religions give people some answers or some consolement for how to maneuver on with one's life. Language, religion, concepts, all deal with representation. Displacement is about substituting one thing for another, but language works that way too. So I've got science here. I'm pulling on the famous modernist painting, of course, here. This is not a pipe, it's a computer-generated image of a pipe. This is not a pipe either. It's a JPEG type file of a copper pipe. The word pipe is not a pipe either, which is spelled with in English anyway, P-I-P-E, which becomes a sound sign. All language is representation. Technology, language is technology as well. And so technology is about the process of representation. Even this screen that you're watching this on is a form of writing, not linear alphabetic, but it's all ones and zeros that are organized in a certain way in binary coding that allows you to see this stuff. So I have a wide sense of what writing is. There are good lectures that you can find on YouTube and the Great Courses Plus, for example, and one of them is by Professor Paul Fry at Yale, who has a good line for thinking about Lacan. He says that for Lacan, unlike Mick Jagger, who's the singer for the Rolling Stones, if you don't know who that is, unlike Mick Jagger, for Lacan, you can never get what you want. But if you try, and you have to eat to stay alive, for example, you might get the things that you need. So let's turn towards literature and aesthetics and desire here. I've talked a lot about human development and structures of identity so far. I've talked about how Lacan updates in some ways with his mirror stage, the Oedipal drama that was Freud's way of talking about human development, and the Totem and Taboo, which is the socialized version of the Oedipal complex. And say, okay, so how do we take this stuff into studying literature or aesthetics, literature or art, to doing critical theory or cultural theory? Because this is, after all, the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. The study of literature is about the study of meaning. and not just how we determine meaning, but how meaning plays a social function in our lives. Literature is about the ways that we use language to encode and memorialize desire, but not just the desires of us as individuals, not the blue blanket desire, the social narratives as well, the social imaginary, as I've been putting it in this particular lecture. Just as language precedes us, just as no one in the room or watching this video has 100% knowledge of the English language, but is nevertheless proficient enough to understand me, hopefully, the field of literature is an open system. Why is all of this important? Well, initially, when literary studies were introduced, and I'll go into this in another lecture, literature was produced by colonizers who took it to the colonies, to maybe people in India when the British invaded India. And it was used to make colonized people aspire to be like their colonizers back in England and Europe. And to see the great people, great figures such as Shakespeare, for example, as the ideal of beauty, as Christianity as the ideal religion, and Christian manners and behaviors as being the ideal, most rational, most civilized way to live. And so in this structure, literature was used ideologically to subjugate other people. It was then associated, if you were literate, it was associated with people who were upper class. So when literature came back to England from the colonies and was starting to be studied in every man's library, and the reading public exploded as more people of lower classes were able to read and read for pleasure, there becomes this explosion in the market of literature, where someone who might have been poorer or lower in class status might be able to become rich by the late 19th century. And so you start getting this kind of tension between capital L literature and lowbrow literature, penny dreadfuls, as they're sometimes called, five and dimes, even pornography later on, right? So that is all encoding different layers of class, and that has cast a shadow over the study of literature since its inception at the professional level. And we've tried to be, as those of us in literary studies have tried to push against that class hierarchy in the past 50 or 60 years, we've tried to develop different kinds of theories of literature. Psychoanalysis is one of them. So when we take a psychoanalytic role of literature and we say, why do we have a concept of the literature? It's not to say that there's this one kind of branch of writing that makes other people better than other people if they've studied it, right? It's actually, well, we could look at literature, whether we're looking at a instruction manual or your iTunes acceptance of cookies, or like an update that you never read all of, but we could look at it from a literary angle, right? Instead of assuming that literature is something essential that is embodied in the text itself. It might be instead embodied in the ways that we look at and engage with textuality itself. So literature is always about, or literary study is always about, consciously acknowledging that there's always a sense of representation, that there's always a sense of play that involves both substitution or metaphor and absence or elision. Literary interpretation articulates and imagines the extensions of exteriority and closure. We fill in gaps all the time. So what do I mean here? Well, let's go quickly back to thinking about a baby. And let's think about the blanket metaphor I've been using here, or blanket as just a thematic device in this lecture. You've got a blue blanket, you've got a baby, and you're lifting it up and pulling it down. You're going peekaboo, peekaboo, right? And the baby's laughing. And you repeat it over and over again for a long time. And what we're doing when we play peekaboo with a baby is we're saying, Dad's not going to be here anymore, but Dad's coming back. I'm not here, ooh, anxiety in the baby, I pull it down, I reassure the baby. Even when you don't see me, I'm still here. I still love you, even though I'm not around, right? And so this develops a sense of what we call closure, a sense that, like, just like I can imagine my body existing in space when I'm walking around or riding my bike, I rely on my sense of being able to determine my body moving through space. That comes with the idea of imagining my parts of myself that I can't see, like my back, for example. Closure fills in the gaps of meaning. When the mom who won't let babies, anyone else hold her baby, sets the baby down, the baby cries and freaks out because the mom has gone away. But eventually the baby learns that when mom's not in the room, it doesn't mean that she's never coming back. Until the day, like Bambi's mother, she just doesn't come back. And then you're really screwed, right? Then you have to figure out a different way to think about exteriority or to get closure. And that sends us to something like religion sometimes, in order to make sense of and find a bigger capacity for closure. But we do this all the time. We fill in gaps all the time, right? When my girlfriend is not here with me right now in my apartment, but she exists out there in the world, of course, but she also exists in my own head as my ideas and conceptions of her. But my ideas and conceptions, of course, are no substitute for the real thing. Lacan is interested in two specific kinds of substitution, and this is something we can take into literary study as well. One is metaphor, which just means to carry over or to transfer. Of course, here's an example. Your love is a beacon of hope. Not a simile, which would be your love is like a beacon of hope, but literally your love is a beacon of hope. Metonymy is a particular kind of metaphor where we take a part for a whole, where we say something like, have you read Shakespeare? We don't mean that did you dig up Shakespeare's body and look at it, right, from right to left, top to down. We mean that there's something that we call Shakespeare that is embodied by all of the various plays and writings that are attributed to this one particular person who lived in England from 1564 to the late 16 teens. There's a great essay by Michel Foucault, who's a critical theorist who will get his own lectures in time here. There's a great essay called What is an Author? And he says that an author, in the one hand, is the person who has written the text, for sure, but that over time, we as a society tend to put certain individual authors on to pedestals, right? And we say this particular author was really great. And so the name Shakespeare isn't just the one person or even just the one play, but becomes what Foucault calls the author function. This is like operating at the level of the superego or the society or the social imaginary. And there's a status or symbolic capital, as Pierre Bourdieu calls it, that gets associated with a particular name or celebrity or something that is widely recognized by various different individuals. So what this gets at is what we say in linguistics all the time. The great Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure was an early thinker of this kind of theory. The signifier is always different from the thing that is signified. The signifier might be the name, pipe, that stands in for a pipe, right? Or the idea of a pipe. It doesn't just stand in for the physical pipe, it stands in for the concept of the pipe. So like the necessary gap in a spark plug, meaning sparks between the sign and the thing signified. So there's Shakespeare, and then there's this concept of Shakespeare, the author function of Shakespeare, English author and the collected writings of, and all of the variants and maybe even fan fiction we could pull in there. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard, that play. in studying literature, what we're doing is we're being attentive to the ways that language and meaning are created through the sparks that connect a gap. We're attentive to the fact that the language could have been something else. We don't read in terms of the kind of plot-based reading, or what I call identity-affirming reading, or book club or consumer criticism when we're studying literature at the critical level or the cultural level. And so this is a big difference between the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory and our approach here, and the context of a book club where people are just reading a book and chatting about whether or not they liked it. It's really immaterial to me whether somebody likes something or doesn't like it. I don't really like the feeling that I get when I'm reading slave narratives from the 1700s and 1800s or Frederick Douglass. It's not like, wow, just like I'm just enjoying the aesthetics of Frederick Douglass. No, it's horrifying, right? It's horrifying to read what happened to Sojourner Truth, for example. But you might develop a sense of admiration. I mean, I tremendously admire Sojourner Truth. But that, I don't read her. I'm not like, oh, I'm just going to kick back tonight and cozy up with my Sojourner Truth. It's not that type of enjoyment that we're after. We're instead looking at things that have happened historically. We're filling in cultural knowledge. And we're looking at the production of what a culture deems desirable, deems publishable over time. And so in that sense, we're dealing with meaning that's being created at the social level. It doesn't mean that we might not have personal affiliations or personal favorite characters or anything like that. But like many anti-heroes, if we take I don't know, a book like Ham on Rye, for example, or Nick Hornby's book High Fidelity, where you have a main character who's just frankly an asshole. You might have a love-hate relationship with the asshole, but the point is not just to be identifying with the person, but reading rather from a literary level that says like, okay, here's a character I don't like. Here's a character who's drawn very thinly, a stock character, for example. What is the author doing? If I read like a writer, what is the author up to in using that character in that particular way? And the same thing with film, right? So when we think about textuality or writing on the internet, flash fiction, for example, fan fiction, I don't really care about like whether or not 50 Shades of Grey is like Twilight fan fiction. The fact that it is from fan fiction or that it's Twilight and like that doesn't mean that it's quite lowbrow for me. And this is something that my students have to kind of get over, is their own snootiness, because sometimes English majors that I've had in the past are like, oh, well, I want to be an English major because I want to be so well read and I want to look down on people. That is not what we're doing with critical theory. That is not that attends to that older notion of literature that might be tied into this myth of meritocracy, or the myth of the idea that by being educated you can lift yourself up out of your class thing. I will tell you, by how little money that I have, and with 2 PhDs and lots of student loan debt, that I might know a lot of different things, but it does not translate over into me escaping my working class origins, right? Not when I'm teaching 6 or 7 classes a semester and trying to start my own business, doing critical theory and the things that I love. So we need to get rid of those kind of false desires that are and that might be imposed onto literary study. I think that's why a lot of people don't read literature today, is because it doesn't give them access to the thing that they thought it was supposed to give them access to, which was class mobility. It doesn't do that anymore, so why major in it? I'm giving you another possibility here by focusing on psychoanalytic criticism, is that one of the things that I will say that it does is it allows us to attend to cultural meaning over time, right? To track social desire, that's what the category of literature is. And that's a broader category that can encapsulate your iTunes agreement, the latest movie that's come out, or Netflix show, or Charles Dickens, or Shakespeare, or Virginia Woolf, or Toni Morrison. So while we have an attention to play within literature and literary thinking, that comes from the idea that everything, all language is representational to begin with, and that there's going to be some kind of active engagement with that ties closely to identity formation too. Metaphors I will distinguish as different from symbols here. So if you know Lacan better than me, or you might have been thinking earlier on in the lecture, oh, he's kind of convoluting the symbolic and the imaginary. It's because I was coming to this slide later on, and my teaching aims in this particular lecture are different than a close reading of Lacan. So a symbol tends to have a more fixed meaning in culture. Like, we see what this means. We know what it means. Even if we don't know Spanish, we see this, and if we're driving, we understand what it means. But metaphors require a little bit more reflection and unpacking. Our languages are moving because of computers and cell phones. They're becoming more and more iconic. There's a whole translation in emojis of Moby Dick, for example, by Herman Melville, which I think is so fascinating and really, really interesting. And there's whole studies of adaptation theory, for example, that we can think about. And so I want to be more aware of and embracing of those types of situations, then I want to be like, oh, the book is better than the movie. It's like, yeah, like the medium changes, and we learn more about the medium and the different performance. There's no one performance of Hamlet that is the performance of Hamlet. We get variations from it. Shakespeare himself never thought he was going to be the immortal Shakespeare while he was alive. He didn't care about having his stuff even published in writing. Like by the time he died, he amassed a good sum of money from stage performances, and seems to have been content with that. So what is all of this other crap that we layer onto this person called Shakespeare, the idea around Shakespeare? I love reading Shakespeare. Shakespeare is worthy of study from the capacity of thinking about that studying Shakespeare is a way to study and track social desire over time. We can study audience reception. We can study the way criticism around Shakespeare has developed and changed over time, and reflected the current moments of the concerns of the societies that those critics were in. That's what we do. I'm not in the business of telling people what is good literature and what is not. I frankly find it really boring. I would not have ever started this endeavor if that's what this was about. So metaphors come to a kind of unpacking, and I think that this is interesting, that what our languages are doing. So some languages work more in terms of like pictograms than our linear alphabetic language does. So we get a metaphor like this. We can see that it's historically derived, because if you were before Thomas Edison and the light bulb, then you might not know what this looks like. But like, we see that this is a light bulb, and then it's a masculinized, gendered figure in a business suit. And so we get something like an idea man from this metaphor, from this icon here, right? But we have to kind of unpack that a little bit more to make meaning. If I go back to Lacan really quickly, Lacan says, who then is the other to whom I am more attached than to myself? Since at the heart of my ascent to my own identity, it is still he who agitates me. So just a glimpse of how complicated Lacan's language can be. Remember, it's the real that drives us. It's the real that breaks up our symbolic imaginaries in Lacan. It's the death of Bambi's mother that breaks up, but also perpetuates the need that Bambi has to go figure out his own way in culture. So I am not the I, and I am not Roger. There's something sort of beneath that's motivating me to even talk. And that is coming from the unconscious. It's coming from the real. And that is the who here that Lacan is referring to. And that is like what drives us to keep making meaning, right? So And what we're so concerned with in cultural and critical theory is how do we make meaning in community with each other? Like, how do we make our lives more meaningful than going to the bar or just having dinner and watching whatever's on Netflix and whatever's on Amazon Prime, whatever's on, available to us in our streaming channels, that, you get more and more fixed through our cookies feeds on our particular tastes, right? How do we make meaning? How do we create and sustain a kind of openness to the world and to other people? These are questions I'm concerned with critical theory and cultural theory. To take it to an identity level again, or linguistic level, in the statement I am Roger, the I equals Roger, and at the same time, the I does not equal Roger. It's a subject, verb, object sentence. Subject I, verb am, Roger, object. Lacan says, what one ought to say is, I am not wherever I am the plaything of my thought. I think of what I am where I do not think to think. You can see how something like queer theory, or later gender theory, like non-binary theory, that wants to resist any kind of location on any of the two poles, wants to attend to perhaps a more authentic existence or attention to the thing that actually drives. And I have a great admiration for transgender and non-binary people, not necessarily because I assume that that is a kind of choice, right? I think the point is that it is not always a choice. There might be a degree of choice to it. And this is what our younger generations of children are thinking about today as they practice whether or not they want to have different pronouns, or whether or not they want to change their name signification as children or as human beings, and or associating and finding that distinction between robot and object, or robot and animation, like the post-human types of qualities, and post-human theory deals with a lot of this. So we can see how Lacan and Freud, maybe they're outdated in some ways, but they can also allow an inflection or a way for us to start understanding more current discourse as well. And that gets at the more hazy aspects, or the things that might be literally beneath identity itself. Identity is constructed. To what extent we can consciously construct it or not, to what extent we're like a Benjamin Franklin type of figure who's very highly attentive to constructing his public identity, or to the things that we don't get much choice in, whether or not I'm a DACA student, right? I'm undocumented. My parents brought me here from somewhere else, and I didn't have a choice in that sort of thing. But nevertheless, it determines so much about what one's identity might be, especially when, like some of my students, they find out that they were a DACA student when they are 18, and they can't go to the colleges they wanted to go to because they didn't even know that they were illegal immigrants. So interesting things to think about with identity and culture. In the statement, I am Roger, both the I and the Roger are substitutes for an absent presence, an elision of a thing signified. I then becomes a metonym for all of my identity's potential. Roger is a metaphorical sound image for both others and myself to locate me as present. Roger is an earlier form, in Anglo-Saxon, is a form of Hrothgar, who's the king in the Beowulf epic, right? His name means mighty spear. The Gar is spear. Hrothgar. I'm named after an uncle in my mom's side of the family, right? So, but it becomes a way to locate this particular Roger and to have some family affiliation. Take this to the literary level. So identity might be in flux and in play, but there might be things that are forces that are driving it from the unconscious. Literature and writing plays this out as well. While communication is necessary, we need to be able to communicate with each other in basic communication. There's a need that's fulfilled through the process of communication. But literature and literary writing, I'm going to say, signifies desire and open potentiality. It is an excess of communication. It might indeed communicate, and it might communicate in more nuanced ways than simple language. But if we're going to call it literature or literary, what we're looking at is a possibility for signification and an open potentiality. So literature isn't one set of authors or one set of books from one set of background, right? And nor is it just about like what happens in the end. We know what happens to Odysseus in the first lines of the Odyssey, which I'll be teaching in another course here. We know he makes it home, okay? He's been away for a long time and he makes it home. End of story. It isn't about that, right? It isn't about what happens even in the plots. It's about the way that things are told and the way that the story unfolds itself. So just like literature and literary writing, we don't know where it ends. It's an open potentiality, but in exploring it, we track what our capabilities are and where our social desires have been. So I say we again because language exists prior to and among people, right? When I was born, I did not know the English language. It was my first language. It was the language that my parents spoke. And because of that, I am restricted and socially formed in that language, and my neural pathways are forged in relation to that the kind of worldviews that accompany that particular linguistic formation, or that are at least very closely aligned. So I'm going to come back to the argument as I'm nearing the end here, and I want to say that to reduce language to a purely communicative function, to ignore the literary, or the aesthetic, in other words, is to remove or at least diminish both the possibility for the developmental growth necessarily engaged in by a subject, a child perhaps, interacting with a linguistic environment, but it is also to simultaneously remove or diminish a capacity for love, compassion, and understanding, the very qualities that are biologically the most evolved aspect of the human brain. So just to unpack this briefly here, I want to say that there is a reason for thinking about the literary and to have aesthetic readings of text and not have literature just mean books, novels, poetry, but film, plays on stage, and even theory itself, the discourse of theory, which I read as literature. I read it as creative writing. I see these performances that I'm doing as creative as well. Why is it a capacity for love? Well, because language, we know, is a technology that was developed so that we could problem solve. And we problem solve by being able to put ourselves in other people's situations and by being able to narrate and do storytelling. That's why science fiction is so great, because it allows us to think about things without destroying everybody first. And a highly developed sense of the literary can, I think, develop like more of a sensitivity to think about other people's experiences that we might not know, because we won't get to know everybody in the world. But it gives us at least a way in to different kinds of thinking. So in an old Freudian conception of children's literature, there was a book that won the National Book Award called The Uses of Enchantment by Bruno Bettelheim. I think it was 1978, around there, he wins the award. Late 70s. And in that book, the argument was that we need to not only teach kids stories, but we need to teach folk tales, we need to teach fairy tales in not cleaned up forms, and with no morals at the end of them, because there was this tendency in Euro-Christian culture to put morals on the ends of Aesop's fables when they were printed. and to clean up, and maybe in Disney, for example, to make some of the stories a little bit less scary. The reason why we want to keep the stories open-ended, not put a moral on the end of them, according to the Freudian model, was that the stories act as maps for a child who's going through a problem. The child then identifies with characters in the story and uses their ability to pretend that they are them, just like a little kid wears a Superman or a Batman outfit or a princess outfit. They use their imaginative play to put themselves into the situations of the characters, and those stories don't have finished endings on them, but then the child can then work out their own problems through negotiation with the actions that fictional characters have done. And the idea is that it is not only children that we don't give. It's not only at the time of children that we need these kinds of stories, that we need fiction and the possibility of creative literary works. We need to keep working on that as even adults in more nuanced types of levels. And it is through that we can create some kind of ability to be not just communicative, but to develop a capacity for understanding and compassion and love. Now some people might say, Roger, that sounds so humanist. Some Marxist critics might say that, and I'll have other lectures where I work on those types of questions as well. But I think that this is a possible argument that we get from looking at psychoanalysis. We are attentive then to the things that are deeply unrepresentable. So like the first letter in Hebrew, the Aleph, which is a consonant and is silent, we don't have access to the origin of all language. We don't have access to all of literature. We don't have access to the origins of ourselves, but we are in the midst of a constant play of displacement and substitution. And attentive to literary qualities, which are very conscious of that play and substitution in other environments, allows us to refract back upon ourselves. So, desire in literature and writing. Desire, from the psychological example of this as the gap between subject and object, desire is a lack that exceeds a need. In literature, this is perhaps at its most basic level accomplished by narrative. So much of literature is based on stories of journeys and returns. And I don't mean this like a lot of my students come in there like, oh, have you read Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey? It's like, it's all about the journey and the return and the trip to the underworld and that kind of structural thing. It's like, yeah. Like, don't try to make a cookie cutter and stamp all literature into your like formal categories that are completely reductive. Actually, what I'm arguing for from this perspective is quite different from that. Some psychoanalytic readings of mythology, for example, might read different characters within a story as different aspects of the same psyche. Kind of works well, especially for Indian literature, for the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Gita, where you do have characters that are different aspects of different so-called selves. But to be really reductive about that is to miss the nuances that we're after. Again, I want to push us towards being attentive to the joy of the playfulness and to something that exceeds the basic communication of what happens. It's like, well, Arjuna is in a chariot and trying to decide whether or not to go to war, and talks to Shiva, and Shiva says, yes, you should go to war. But Shiva is really Krishna, so Krishna tells him, who's also his cousin, who's also his chariot driver. They're all the same thing, but they just tell Arjuna, yes, you should go to war because that's what your dharma is. And that's basically the Bhagavad Gita. I don't think that really works. I think that there's a reason why that little sliver of a story is part of this much, much bigger thing called the Mahabharata. So to come back to another literary theorist, to put it in Roland Barthes' terms, we may indeed get pleasure out of a plot, but we return to some plots again and again. Think about people who return again and again to the Lord of the Rings at the holidays, or to the Star Wars movies at the holidays. You know, it's like affirming of colonization, as I might think some of those movies are. Yes, I think that Star Wars is very colonizing. But people return, nevertheless, to certain plots over and over again, just as kids do this. With my sister, she said for 5 years in a row, her kids just only wanted Goodnight Moon as the bedtime story. You know, they might have a lot of different books, but they just want the same one over and over again. Why is that? You know, what is the work of the story doing that gets repeated over and over again? Well, it's something that goes beyond just plot and what happens, right? So we return to some plots again and again because they exceed pleasure and they become bliss. That's why we reread our favorite books. In psychoanalysis, desire relates to Freud's popularization of the term libido for instinctual drives. Freud meant this in terms of the perpetuation of the species. So yes, it is about sex and sexuality, but it's not about like just wanting to have sex with your mother, and the way that maybe Jim Morrison puts it in one of the Doors songs, and This Is the End, which is featured in the great movie Apocalypse Now. An adaptation of Conrad's book, right? Joseph Conrad's book about Africa, Heart of Darkness. But is the book better than the movie? Unsurprisingly, in popular culture, the term often goes through a linguistic broadening to characterize just sexual drives alone. We live in a society that's consumed with and sees sex all around it all the time. But just as one sexual act does not extinguish a desire for love, and may happen completely outside of love, it may function as a procreative need for the species. But Freud has another characterization of love that he calls eros, which is a love that signifies an inexhaustible perpetuity. He also has a death drive that I've not talked about in this particular lecture as well. So what we're doing in psychoanalysis is we're looking at the unconscious, the things that drive us. What we're doing with literature is we're looking at that same thing, but operating at the level of culture. And so it might be a particular author that we're reading, but what we're seeing is what their book is saying about the culture or the societal desires of the moment at its particular time of being written, or what it's speaking to, or how it's being used in a different cultural moment. So how is Shakespeare being used in 2022 differently than in 1610? Psychoanalysis gives us a way into that, to thinking about social desire, and it gives us a way to move away from that class-based notion of what literature is. It also makes us think about how this might all relate back to our own self-formation, right? To our own identity construction, or the aspects of our identity or aspects of our lives that we don't have that kind of choice over, that I can't just choose to convert, right away to another religion and learn it, or to convert to another worldview. It's not something that I can just do by choice. It's something that would take so much study and so much time and so much imbrication of myself into another cultural context. So literary competence and being an accomplished reader of literature is not to be judged at one particular instance of a human life. It's not just what you read in high school, and we should not only teach the books that, I see the kids reading the same books in the high schools in my area that I read when I was in high school, like Catcher in the Rye or The Great Gatsby. These are good books. I like them as novels. I think that they're great novels, but they don't necessarily speak to high school students in the same way today as they might have spoken to high school students if somebody read J.D. Salinger in the 1950s or early 1960s, right? There's something much more transgressive about Catcher in the Rye than that it doesn't necessarily do today. And so I want to keep an openness, right? to that category of the literary. And that we should be attentive to things that are coming out now, and we should be attentive to older stuff. But we shouldn't be attentive to older stuff like Shakespeare because Shakespeare is the golden rule, or Shakespeare is going to make us more sophisticated people, but for the reason that Shakespeare gives us a way to track social desire over time, at least in this lecture. So we don't want to set a limit to desire or to eros or to human capability here in this reading. Insofar as we can track language, writing, and literature over time, we certainly also track history and culture, which at times produces a binding, even in the sense of religio, which is that word we get religion from the verb in Latin religare, or to bind. So that becomes really important. And come back to the high schoolers I was just talking about a little bit ago. When only certain groups get to decide what texts are literarily important, the desire of those individuals collects into a cultural manifestation. And so that's what we've seen happen with literature over time. That's the concern that people have with only white male authors, for example, is that over time only certain groups were represented as literary and capable, and to the exclusion of women, to the exclusion of people of color, for example. And so they set up these aesthetic standards that are based in this one modality of living that these other people will never embody, just like I will never know what it means to be pregnant in my body, right? So it sets up a kind of universal standard that is not universal in terms of human experience. People feel excluded from it. And this happens from a very young level. So I take this book as an example, And Tango Makes Three. It's a great children's book. It's about two male penguins, it's a true story, who were given a fertilized egg, and they raised it together because the zookeeper thought that, it was in New York, thought that they were lovers, that they'd made partners for life, as these penguins do. And they did, and they were two male penguins, and they seemed to have what mimics a nuclear family for us as humans. And so the ideology in the book at the end is like, and they're going to bed, which happens at the end of a lot of children's books, and they went to bed just like all of the other families in the zoo, just like all of the other families in New York. And there's this sense that like same-sex families are just like all other families, right? So there's a very kind of there's a queer theory kind of critique that we could give to this and say that that's kind of like this in the nuclear family. It's mimicking this binary heteronormative relationship that they're imposing onto same-sex couples and a same-sex marriage at a time when same-sex marriage had just more recently become legalized in our culture. But they're also claiming naturality because these are of course animals, so it does exist in nature. But the justification then becomes for the nuclear family. So what happens to all of the families that are not that way, or to human cultures, indigenous cultures that don't maybe necessarily see the nuclear family as being the sole core of human existence, as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights might attest. We also see that there are people left out when only certain people's stories get told. So those who are not represented are literally denied access to full citizenship in a community that over time only the same stories are being told over and over and over again. The people who can't identify are then further marginalized and alienated. So we currently live in a time in the vast expansion of what actual materials, genres, and texts, etc. may be considered to be literature and writing. Literature is not just like the fancy stuff on the shelf behind me. To those who consider themselves outside of a system, they often resent what appears to be hegemonic, which is a term that comes from Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks, which I'll probably do a lecture on at some point. The core center that determines what has value in a particular society and whose stories get told, like Star Wars over and over and over again. Lord of the Rings over and over again. Not that I don't like these stories or haven't enjoyed them at certain points in my life, but why over and over again? Why over and over again the apocalyptic stories in our culture? Does it have something to do with something like I think Frederick Jameson said something like this, that we can imagine the end of the world before we can imagine the end of capitalism, right? That's an interesting critical theory idea. Like, what are the limits that our cultural products put on our own imaginative potential as societies? To those highly invested in the potential for literature to express desire and potentiality, generic or genre or generic or surface engagements with literature as only pleasure and not as bliss seem backward and ignorant. So I do think that there is a kind of tendency to be like, if you're only reading a novel for whether or not you like the character or don't like it, I find that a superficial way of reading a book. And I might seem snooty if I do that. But my snootiness does not come from the sort of class thing that's saying like, oh, that's not good literature. I am not snooty about The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, which my students oftentimes are. I find the stark language, short sentences, the lack of vivid imagery that characterizes the storytelling narrative voice in that book of Katniss Everdeen as being entirely appropriate to a young woman who's been traumatized and doesn't know her sexuality yet. I think it is a brilliant example of the form of the text conveying the meaning of the character's being. And we might not like it, right? It might not feel comfortable. It's not about liking it. It's not about me just like enjoying what Sojourner Truth had to go through as a writer, or Frederick Douglass had to go through as a writer. That's not what it's about. It's about something more. To those highly invested in the potential for literature, once again, to express desire and potentiality, generic or surface engagements with literature only as pleasure and not as bliss seem backwards and ignorant. It's okay not to like the book and to finish it. It's okay to read Naked Lunch and be like, that was a pain in the ass to read. I did not necessarily understand it. I think that there are reasons to engage in certain texts and to ask questions of why did the author do this in this particular way. Aldous Huxley characterized Ulysses by James Joyce, and they were good friends, and like Ulysses is like this achievement of Western literature. And Aldous Huxley's, if you read him about it, he's like, yeah, Ulysses just shows to the extent like the limitations of what the novel as a genre can do. I mean, he isn't even talking about Finnegan's Wake at that point. There are ways when we're doing critical theory, when we're doing cultural theory, it is just different than the consumer stuff. It's not to say that you shouldn't do book clubs or do consumer critique. It's just not what I'm interested here at the center of critical and cultural theory. I want us to go deeper. I want us to do more. That's what this is about. So to end here, just to be transparent, I say that to be involved in the teaching of literature and writing is to be involved in the political process of what social desire is and how it's encoded, of who's included and who is excluded from participating in the language or languages that no one person owns, but which come to shape and speak us as individuals. As always, all teaching, even my teaching, is indoctrination. Choose wisely. I try to be as transparent as possible. If you've enjoyed this, please try to support the Center for Critical Theory, or Center for Critical and Cultural Theory, on Patreon, or sign up for our courses. I'm doing this as a labor of love and bliss right now, and I'm trying to find a way to live just doing this, and to bring this kind of knowledge and other people like me to a broader public endeavor to take things to a little bit deeper level of engagement than we get through something like edutainment or popular podcasts, things like that. So thanks very much for your attention, and we'll catch up with you in another lecture. Feel free to reach out. Have a good night or day, wherever you are.